Welcome back to Sociology of Law. Today we're going to shift topics from talking about civil law to talking about legislation and the creation of new legal rules with a focus on laws about drugs. And so if you think back to the introduction of the course, when we talked about variation in law, one type of variation we pointed to is that different societies prohibit different sorts of conduct. And something might be legal in one time and place, but illegal in another time and place. And one classic example of this is in America, alcohol was illegal for a period of about a decade, but then it was made legal once again. And so, seeing this kind of example, we could ask ourselves, why do rules change? Why do things get prohibited? Or why do things that were once prohibited become acceptable again? Well, one way to understand what the law forbids or doesn't forbid is to start with the cultural values a society has. Every society, there are certain things that the people value or put, and this influences the kind of rules that society comes up with. For example, when it comes to regulating drugs, values that might lead us to prohibit drugs include things like the value of self-control. People in American society traditionally valued having some control over yourself and your own behavior, and if you're high or drunk, that becomes more difficult. There's also a tradition of valuing hard work, and that leads people to look down upon anything that might be distracting you from hard work, anything like recreation or being too inebriated to work. And of course, people are also broadly concerned with preventing harm to others, both to their users, who might suffer ill effects from addiction or overdose, or to other people who might suffer ill effects because someone they know is addicted or overdosed. Addicts might steal to fund their habit. Drunks might fail to take care of their children. People are distraught to see a loved one destroy themselves. So you could look at these values and say, okay, in light of these, it makes sense why this society would try to control intoxicating substances. But there's a big gap between those broad values and the specific actual rules we get. It is not a straight line going from values to rules. If you just knew a society had those values, could you predict accurately exactly which substances it would prohibit? Could you predict that it would prohibit marijuana, but not alcohol? Could you predict that it would give harsher sentences to some kinds of cocaine, but not others? Could you predict something like the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which was the act that effectively criminalized marijuana? You see, when we leave the realm of these abstract values and go to the realm of concrete rules, we find a lot of different contingencies and a lot of competing factors affecting the actual rules we get. I mean, for one thing, people differ in the weights they apply to different values. Even if we all agree that, yeah, hard work's good, some people seem to have a stronger value on this than others. Some people you would look at, and if you don't share their value, you think that person is a workaholic and they need to settle down and enjoy life a bit more, and hey, relax, man, it's not a sin to have a vacation now and again. So people have these disagreements about how much value to place on things and how to balance competing values, like the balance between freedom and liberty on the one hand and preventing harm on the other. I might want to prevent you from the harm of doing drugs, but that means I'm also telling you what you can and can't do with your own body. Do I also regulate your diet? Do I also tell you where you can go and walk at night? And of course, there's also all kinds of interested constituencies and practical concerns. So we look at something like the Marijuana Tax Act. Why is it a tax act? Well, without getting into the details, the structure of American law at the time made it very difficult to create a nationwide prohibition on marijuana, but you could do a tax on marijuana quite easily. And so they passed this tax on marijuana saying it's not illegal to have marijuana per se. It's illegal to have marijuana unless you've paid your marijuana tax and used it to buy a marijuana stamp from the government. But here's a condition. To get your marijuana stamp, you need to have marijuana on you. And if you show up carrying marijuana to get your marijuana stamp, then they bust you for having marijuana without previously having acquired a stamp. It's what they call a catch-22, a rule that's impossible to fulfill. And so this effectively criminalized marijuana, but it technically wasn't a criminal prohibition. It's technically a tax. And when they were creating this tax act, there's all kinds of little caveats in it. Like, for example, there's an exemption for hemp seeds, because apparently bird seed manufacturers really relied on hemp seeds, and they had lobbyists in Washington when the law was being passed who made sure that there was some sort of fine print in the law saying it's okay to have hemp seeds used for bird feed, but if you do it, you have to sterilize the seeds in this exact sort of way. So you have all these different specifics that come into play when we go from our values to creating the rules, and it makes the specific nature of the rules very unpredictable. Still, we can identify some general social dynamics that go into changing the rules, whether it's prohibiting something or getting rid of an old prohibition. And someone who's written about this is Howard Becker, and Becker describes this process of creating new rules using this concept of moral entrepreneurs. There are certain individuals who take it upon themselves to take the lead in getting a law changed, and he uses this term moral entrepreneur to show that this is a bit almost like founding a business. This is a full-time job for these people, campaigning to try to get society concerned with some action they see as immoral. And these entrepreneurs launch what he calls moral crusades. And he uses that word crusade to try to get at the fact that these moral entrepreneurs are often extremely zealous. They see themselves as righteous, and they see this issue as extremely important, something not to be compromised on. They're often dedicated to this one issue, which is something that can bring the moral crusaders campaigning for these new rules into conflict with the people whose job it is to actually figure out the details of the rules or to enforce the rules. Because legislators in Congress are police officers on the streets, they tend to worry about many, many different things. They have many different rules and considerations they're trying to balance. Versus the moral crusader, this might be their one crusade in life, the one thing they focus most of their time and attention on. And so it's easy for them to say, this is the most important thing, we should throw all our resources into combating this evil, and we should make no compromises with the devil. Meanwhile, the people actually tasked with making those concrete rules operate in practice have to worry about a lot more practical stuff. And one thing you see in moral crusades that are successful and that result in new rules getting created is you see moral panics. And this is the term sociologists use to refer to a period of sudden and often exaggerated concern with some sort of social problem. So the idea is that in a moral panic, this social problem suddenly comes to everybody's attention and is regarded as being pervasive and severe and widespread. And this term panic points to the fact that, sometimes, quite often, the extent of the threat is exaggerated, which is not to say that the threat's not there. Like, for example, drugs really do harm people. Addiction can destroy a person. But in the time period leading up to the prohibition of a drug, you often see these sensationalized tales catching on in the media. Today we would call it going viral. And these tales are sometimes completely unfounded, they're just made up. And sometimes they're real things that happen, but they're a little bit exaggerated, or they're made to seem more typical than they actually are, when really they're a very rare aberration. And you see exaggerations of the scope of the problem, grossly inflated estimates of the number of people using the drug, or grossly inflated estimates of the number of deaths due to it, and things like that. And of course, in some extreme cases, the moral panic is completely divorced from reality. It's not common, but it does happen. Things like witchcraft scares, for example, are cases where the deviance is just wholly imagined. In other cases, the moral panic might be pointing to very real problems, but exaggerating their extent. So with all that in mind, let's consider the evolution of drug laws in the US. In the 1800s, there were hardly any laws regulating drugs, and it's not because people didn't use them. People use drugs all the time. Alcohol, of course, has been consumed in large amounts ever since the country's founding. And in the 1800s, you also had people using all kinds of other drugs, including opium. Opium was included in medicines that were sold over the counter. It was included in tonics that were prescribed as just general purpose health aids to give you health and vitality, like taking vitamins or something like that. And people didn't necessarily know they were taking opium because, the ingredients on these tonics were not listed. And this actually became a problem. You had opium addiction rising in the late 19th century, especially after the Civil War, because during the Civil War, millions of people were maimed horribly on battlefields, and while undergoing surgeries or recovering from their wounds, they were given morphine. And a lot of them got hooked on morphine and came home from the war addicted to morphine. And so beginning in the late 19th century, you had the push for prohibiting alcohol and for regulating opium. And so by the early 1900s, the moral crusade succeeded, and we have our first legal regulations of drugs. So in 1906, we get the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act is why food and drugs nowadays have a list of ingredients on them. It's a legal obligation to tell people what they're consuming, so you can't be unknowingly giving them opium. And the Harrison Narcotic Act criminalized opium and cocaine. And from there, the snowball kept rolling. By 1919, we had the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol. And this was not a very popular prohibition. It lasted for about 10 years before being repealed by another amendment of the Constitution. And in 1937, there was the Marijuana Tax Act, which criminalized marijuana. So who were the moral crusaders behind this regulation of drugs and alcohol? Well, one major group was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this organization led the campaign against alcohol. Notably, the leadership of this organization was upper-class women, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, beginning in the late 1800s, led a campaign against alcohol that succeeded in prohibition. Another example of a moral crusader would be Henry Anslinger, who worked at the Bureau of Narcotics. After opium and cocaine were prohibited, there was a Bureau of Narcotics to oversee this prohibition, and Henry Anslinger, who worked there, wanted to expand the authority of this agency to include marijuana. Now, at the time, marijuana was a relatively rare thing in the US. It was something mostly used by Mexican immigrants, and so a lot of people hadn't even heard of it. And so Henry Anslinger had to do a lot of work to get people afraid of this drug they had never heard of before. So he and the Bureau of Narcotics put a lot of resources into propaganda to raise awareness of marijuana and to frighten people of its dangerous effects. And so you saw propaganda portraying marijuana users as incredibly violent, as losing all self-control, becoming hyperactive and dangerous. And it actually portrayed the effects of marijuana as looking more like the effects of some sort of intense amphetamine that would induce psychosis. People were said to go crazy and violent and commit rapes and murders and become physically addicted. And one product of this time period in this campaign was a film called Reefer Madness, which supposedly was a true-to-life story depicting the horrible effects of marijuana addiction and its connection to violent behavior and sexual promiscuity. And so in this week's reading, the authors Good and Ben Yehuda discuss some of the patterns you see in moral panics over drug use. And these panics all feature some of the same beats. There's usually some popular horror stories about somebody doing something atrocious under the effects of one of the drugs. And these horror stories, whether they're true or false, are treated as typical, as a common outcome of the drug. There's a belief that the drug is far more widespread than it actually is. And there's also an association of the drug with violence by minorities. And so you want to get people on the side of being against the drug. You say, look, it's making black people violent towards white people. It's making these Mexican immigrants violent towards white people. Also, there's often this notion of specifically a sexual threat to white women. So, for example, opium, the campaign against opium, one of the charges was that opium led to white women cohabiting with Chinese men. And with cocaine, one of the ways to get people in the South to turn against it was to say, well, cocaine leads black people to rape white women. And of course, marijuana was also said to lead to rape and madness. So you had this period of about 20 or 30 years where all these drugs were criminalized, and use of these drugs was pretty rare. But in the 1960s, you had a couple of different things going on. You had this giant baby boom youth cohort and their youth culture rebelling against all the traditions. You had the war in Vietnam and a lot of soldiers in Vietnam having easy access to drugs they didn't have easy access to in America, and a lot of them coming home with addictions. You had the invention of new drugs like LSD and the rise of this hippie counterculture. And so you had rising drug use in the US, leading in 1971 to the first war on drugs. And I put war in scare quotes because this war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon really doesn't look like a war. It was mainly therapeutic. It resulted in a lot of funding to addiction treatment programs. So even though they called it a war on drugs, it's not necessarily what you would think a war on drugs would entail. And by the mid-70s, you had this push to decriminalize marijuana. And the next period of rising concern was in the 1980s, when crack cocaine, which is a cheaper form of cocaine, was being used predominantly in poorer African-American neighborhoods. And this led to another war on drugs under Ronald Reagan. And this war on drugs looks a lot more like a war. This is when you see very, very stiff penalties for drug use, when you see the rise of things like no-knock raids by the DEA, and even the DEA venturing into quasi-military expeditions in Latin America. This war looks a little bit more like a war. And it results in controversy, as Prohibition resulted in controversy in the 1930s. People complain about civil liberties. People complain about disparate impact on poor and black neighborhoods. People complain about the fact that a form of cocaine used by poor people is getting a harsher sentence than the form of cocaine used by rich people, that sort of thing. By the 2000s, this war on drugs had cooled somewhat. It had tempered a little bit. And you started seeing the push for decriminalization of marijuana and lesser penalties for other sorts of drugs. And this has continued up into our own day when marijuana actually has been decriminalized in several states. A few years ago, I was in Seattle for a conference, and they were having a marijuana festival of some kind. And I don't smoke marijuana, but I walked by just to look at it because it was very striking to see that, when I was in college, if you smoked, you worried that the cops would arrest you. And here you could see all these people smoking in a public place with cops standing around them, guarding them to protect them from, people breaking into their festival and causing them trouble. And it just seemed like night and day compared to the way things were 15 years ago. But it seems like this pattern of, the pendulum swinging back and forth, we're pushing for decriminalization and lesser drug laws, and now something raises our concerns and we push for more regulations and harsher drug laws. And I gotta wonder how things are going to turn out with the opioid crisis. Which, I've had some colleagues skeptical of this whole idea of there being an opioid crisis. Is this just another exaggeration that we see in moral panics? Well, if you look at the overdose statistics, it does seem like a lot more people are dying of opioids than they used to. And so with this rising death rate, Will we see a massive push to regulate opioids? Already you see people saying doctors shouldn't prescribe as many for painkillers, and other people saying, how could you doom pain sufferers to not have their pain medication because other people are abusing the drugs? And so I'm very curious in coming years to see in which direction the law will go on this.